Europe before the Black Death was not a dead continent waiting to be shocked into life. It was crowded, ambitious, noisy, mobile, and increasingly connected. Fields had been cleared for centuries. Forests had been pushed back. Markets multiplied. Town walls enclosed workshops, guild halls, counting rooms, taverns, churches, hostels, and alleys thick with the smells of trade, waste, smoke, and food. Roads were bad, but people moved anyway. Pilgrims, merchants, messengers, soldiers, friars, students, and sailors crossed kingdoms that were politically divided yet economically entangled. Grain moved, wool moved, wine moved, salt moved, silver moved. People argued over rents, rights, taxes, jurisdiction, and salvation in a Europe that was alive with institutions and alive with strain. Kings wanted more revenue. Lords wanted labor. Towns wanted privileges. Peasants wanted room to survive. Priests wanted souls disciplined. Merchants wanted predictability. The continent was not peaceful, and it was not equal, but it was recognizably in motion. That motion mattered because the same networks that carried profit, devotion, letters, armies, and ambition could also carry death. When the plague came, it did not arrive in a frozen medieval world. It arrived in a world dense enough, hungry enough, and connected enough to help it travel fast. The Black Death did not remake Europe by striking emptiness. It remade Europe by tearing through a civilization already under pressure, already interdependent, already used to thinking of movement as necessity. To understand how thoroughly the plague transformed Europe, you have to begin by understanding the scale of the web into which it entered. The 14th century sat inside a larger Afro-Eurasian system of exchange more integrated than many people imagine when they hear the word medieval. Caravans crossed inner Asia. Ships crossed the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Ports linked the Levant to Italian city-states, and those city-states linked the Mediterranean to northern Europe through rivers, fairs, brokers, and credit. Mongol rule across large stretches of Eurasia did not create perfect safety, but it did make long-distance movement across parts of the continent more feasible than in many earlier periods. Goods, stories, technologies, and religious ideas circulated along these routes. So did microbes. The disease that would become the Black Death in European memory did not belong only to Europe. It emerged from a larger world, probably in complex ecological zones where rodents, fleas, climate shifts, and human movement interacted in ways no one at the time could understand. Long before physicians in Paris or priests in Florence tried to explain the plague, the conditions for its spread had already been built by trade, empire, war, and environment. The catastrophe that later seemed to descend upon Europe like divine wrath or cosmic punishment was also, in a colder sense, a product of connection. A continent increasingly stitched into wider networks discovered that networks carry disaster as efficiently as they carry wealth. The people who would first witness the plague in Europe did not know the name Yersinia pestis. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about vectors. They did not understand the microbial logic of transmission. What they knew was sensation, sequence, rumor, and terror. They knew that apparently healthy people could develop fever, weakness, vomiting, swelling, blackening skin, delirium, and death with horrifying speed. They knew that households could be alive with voices one week and silent the next. They knew that priests who came to comfort the sick sometimes died after them, and that physicians with learning and instruments often seemed no better protected than laborers with no theory at all. They knew that plague was not behaving like familiar illness. It did not observe rank. It did not spare the devout. It did not stop at city gates. It did not seem to negotiate. To later historians, the Black Death can be modeled, debated, and situated in ecological and demographic patterns. To contemporaries, it often felt like the collapse of the ordinary grammar of cause and effect. You could not reason your way to safety if the very people trained to interpret the world disagreed about what was happening. Astrologers looked to the heavens. Clerics looked to sin. Physicians looked to corruption in the air, imbalance in the humors, and dangerous conjunctions. Ordinary people looked to who had sickened first, what neighborhoods had begun to empty, and whether anyone anywhere had found a remedy that worked. In the absence of certainty, fear became one of the plague's most contagious forces. By the time plague-bearing ships or traders carried the disease toward Europe, the disaster already had a history elsewhere. It had moved through regions beyond European political control and beyond most European understanding. Later chroniclers and modern historians would debate exact points of origin and pathways of transfer, and some of those debates remain open. But what matters for Europe is that by the 1340s the disease had entered the trade and war corridors linking the Black Sea to Mediterranean commerce. The famous story of Kaffa, the Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula, has often been told as a dramatic hinge in which Mongol besiegers and infected corpses helped send plague westward. Some details of that story are contested, but the larger truth remains. The Black Sea world was a crucial zone of transmission, and the ships moving from it into Mediterranean ports were capable of carrying far more than cargo. Sailors brought rats. Rats carried fleas. People carried infection in their bodies. The sea, which had long enriched Italian commerce, now became an avenue of acceleration. Ports that depended on openness were about to learn what openness could cost. Europe's commercial brilliance contained a hidden vulnerability. To be connected is to be exposed. When plague entered the Mediterranean in 1347, the effect was not immediately interpreted as the beginning of one of the most devastating demographic collapses in human history. It arrived as episode before it became epic. In Messina, in Sicily, ships came into harbor carrying crews diminished by illness and death. Some accounts describe sailors dead or dying, bodies and swollen flesh, making the horror visible before local authorities fully understood the danger. Ports are places built on decision. Unload or refuse, quarantine or admit, trust commerce or fear contamination. But effective public health machinery of the kind later centuries would develop did not yet exist. Officials could react, but they had little reliable science and little precedent adequate to the scale of what was arriving. Even when suspicious ships were driven away, they rarely vanished into the sea forever. They moved elsewhere. The plague could be delayed in one place only to appear in another, and every delay brought rumor. Messina did not simply experience disease. It became a warning signal for a wider world not yet ready to hear what it meant. Soon the disease spread to other Mediterranean ports, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and beyond, carried by the same maritime logic that had made these cities rich. The route westward was not a mystery after the fact. It followed the arteries of exchange Europe had already chosen for itself. Once established in coastal cities, the plague did what interconnected societies make possible. It multiplied direction. Sea routes carried it from port to port. Roads carried it inland. River systems carried it into market centers. Armies, traders, pilgrims, clerics, and fleeing families each played a role, whether knowingly or not. The plague did not need one perfect chain of transmission because the continent offered it many. It moved through Italy, southern France, the Iberian Peninsula, and then northward and eastward, crossing political borders with contemptuous ease. Kingdoms could mint coin, declare war, arrest heretics, and issue legal codes, but they could not order plague to halt at a frontier. That mattered politically. Medieval rulers often projected authority as personal, territorial, and hierarchical. The Black Death exposed how weak those forms of control could be before biological reality. It also revealed how every local decision sat inside a system larger than any one authority. A city that had escaped this month might not escape the next. A village spared in spring might be devastated in autumn. Distance was no guarantee. Reputation was no shield. This is one of the first ways the plague remade Europe. It showed a continent organized by overlapping powers how little those powers meant when the thing moving through the system was not an army to negotiate with or a tax to collect, but disease. The symptoms themselves helped make the Black Death unforgettable. Chroniclers described fever, headaches, weakness, vomiting, foul breath, coughing, and most notoriously the swellings, buboes, appearing in the groin, armpits, or neck. Some victims developed dark blotches or necrotic patches that later generations would connect to the name Black Death, though that label itself became common much later. Some died within days. Others lingered a bit longer, only to collapse with terrifying suddenness. Not every presentation was identical. Pneumonic forms were especially feared because they seemed to pass directly from person to person through breath and proximity. Septicemic cases could kill before much could be done or understood. Medieval observers were not sorting these categories with modern precision, but they were recognizing patterns of horror. Illness often came with speed that mocked preparation. The familiar rhythm of sickness, caregiving, relapse, or recovery was replaced by abrupt deterioration. Time itself changed. A letter could be overtaken by death before it arrived. A household could plan for one burial and require 4. The plague's violence lay not only in its lethality, but in its compression. It rearranged the timeline of grief. Mourning normally follows death. During the Black Death, mourning often began while the sick were still present, because everyone could see how little separated symptom from funeral. Cities suffered in ways both spectacular and intimate. The density that made urban life productive also made it vulnerable. Houses pressed close together. Waste accumulated. Markets gathered strangers from many districts. Wells, bread ovens, workshops, and churches concentrated bodies into shared spaces. In places like Florence, Siena, Venice, Paris, and London, civic life depended on proximity. That proximity now carried dread. Streets could still be crowded, but the crowd had changed meaning. It no longer signified only trade or festivity. It signified risk. Chronicles and later literary accounts, most famously Boccaccio's introduction to the Decameron, preserve scenes of social breakdown, selective retreat, sudden luxury amid fear, and households cut apart by death. Some descriptions surely heighten drama, but even allowance for literary shaping leaves the core intact. Urban society lost its trust in ordinary nearness. Neighbors avoided one another. Some fled into country villas if they could. Some shut themselves in. Others surrendered to fatalism. The city, once a machine for concentrating life, became a machine for multiplying apprehension. Bells rang for the dead until the dead were too many for bells to individualize. Officials struggled to maintain order. Grave diggers, priests, physicians, notaries, and servants worked inside a world where work itself had become exposure. Urban prestige did not save anyone. If anything, prominence could make the city's suffering more visible and therefore more terrifying to the wider world. In the countryside, the plague unfolded differently, but no less radically. Villages did not have the same density as cities, yet they were not isolated sanctuaries. They were tied to market towns, manor houses, roads, and labor obligations. Priests moved between settlements. Grain moved, rent moved, messages moved, families visited one another. Seasonal work drew people together. The plague could therefore enter a village and feel at first like misfortune in one household before revealing itself as something much larger. Rural communities often had fewer resources with which to respond. A small number of deaths could cripple essential labor at planting or harvest. If the blacksmith died, the absence mattered. If the priest died, the sacramental order of the village was shaken. If multiple members of a family died, inheritance and tenancy questions followed immediately on grief. The countryside also remembered the plague differently because memory there was tied not only to bodies but to land. Fields went untilled. Holdings changed hands. Livestock wandered or were sold. The demographic blow could become visible in hedges, rents, abandoned strips, and renegotiated obligations. Europe was not remade only by fear in cities. It was remade by missing people in fields. The Black Death also transformed the experience of care. In ordinary illness, caregiving can be an act of kinship that reaffirms social bonds. During plague, caregiving became morally exalted and physically dangerous at once. Family members, neighbors, nurses, and clergy faced a brutal choice: go near the sick and risk infection, or withdraw and live with the shame of abandonment. Some cared heroically, some fled. Many did both in succession, trying to balance duty and fear. The plague therefore entered ethics at the level of the household. What does love require when touch may kill? What does priestly obligation require when hearing confession may bring your own death? What does charity mean when almsgiving, washing, tending, and burying all increase exposure? Accounts from the period preserve both self-sacrifice and social collapse because both happened. There were priests who stayed and died. There were priests who fled. There were children abandoned. There were servants who remained when masters ran. There were masters who dismissed servants to save themselves. To tell the Black Death only as demographic catastrophe is to miss this moral intimacy. Europe was remade partly because plague forced people to renegotiate the duties by which everyday life had previously felt intelligible. Medicine in the 14th century did not stand helpless because people were stupid. It stood helpless because it was operating within frameworks not equipped to solve what had arrived. Learned physicians drew on Galenic theories of humors, environmental corruption, celestial conjunctions, and the management of bodily balance. They advised purging, bloodletting, controlled diets, aromatic substances, and avoidance of foul air. Some recommendations may have accidentally helped in limited ways by encouraging separation or ventilation. Many did little or nothing. What is striking is not merely that medieval medicine failed by modern standards, but how openly its authority was tested. University-trained doctors wrote learned treatises. Towns consulted them. Courts valued them. Yet the disease kept advancing. This widened a crack between knowledge and efficacy. The more elaborate the explanation, the more brutal the contrast when the patient died anyway. People did not necessarily stop valuing expertise, but they learned that expertise might interpret disaster without controlling it. That lesson matters because one of the long-term consequences of the plague was a changed relationship between institutions and trust. The church, the university, municipal government, aristocratic power, all were judged not only by what they claimed to know or represent, but by what they could do when mass death entered the room. Spiritual response was therefore intense, varied, and unstable. Some people saw the plague as divine punishment for sin. That interpretation made immediate intuitive sense in a Christian culture steeped in providence, judgment, and moral causality. If God had permitted such suffering, then surely human wickedness had summoned it. This reading drove penitential practices, special prayers, masses, processions, almsgiving, confessions, and personal vows. But it could also generate despair. If the plague was punishment, why were children dying? Why were clergy dying? Why did piety not reliably shield the devout? These questions did not eliminate religious belief. Often they deepened it. Yet deepening is not the same as stabilizing. The church remained central during and after the Black Death, but the experience damaged the aura of clerical invulnerability and spiritual predictability. Some clergy died in shocking numbers because they continued ministering to the sick. Others were resented for absence, corruption, or perceived cowardice. Replacements were sometimes undertrained. The pastoral fabric thinned. People still needed sacraments, burial, consolation, and interpretation, but the plague made the institutional church appear at once indispensable and compromised. That tension would linger in European religious culture long after the first wave had passed. One of the ugliest and most consequential aspects of the Black Death was the acceleration of scapegoating. In times of unexplained catastrophe, frightened populations often seek human causes for inhuman scales of suffering. During the plague, Jewish communities across parts of Europe were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring to spread disease. These accusations were false, murderous, and rooted in older anti-Jewish hatreds that the plague intensified rather than created. Pogroms followed in numerous places. Whole communities were attacked, expelled, forced to convert, or annihilated. Officials sometimes tried to restrain the violence. In other places they enabled or exploited it. The point is not only that scapegoating occurred, but that it became part of how Europe metabolized the plague. When a society cannot control a disaster, it may try to restore the illusion of control by identifying an enemy within. The Black Death remade Europe not just by killing people, but by revealing and worsening the hatreds already available for mobilization. Memory of the plague cannot be separated from memory of the violence done in its name. The same urge to force meaning out of terror helped fuel the rise of penitential movements like the flagellants. Bands of men traveled from town to town whipping themselves in public, staging ritual suffering as an offering to divine justice and mercy. Their processions could appear dramatic, devout, and socially electrifying. Here was visible repentance in an age of invisible contamination. Here was action in the face of helplessness. Yet these movements also alarmed church authorities and civic leaders because they escaped easy control, encouraged apocalyptic emotion, and sometimes intensified hostility toward Jews or other perceived enemies. The flagellants show how plague destabilized not only bodies and markets, but spiritual authority itself. When ordinary institutional channels seemed inadequate, charismatic and theatrical alternatives could surge. Europe was being remade at the level of religious performance as much as demography. Then there is the question that has shadowed the Black Death in every generation since. How many died? The honest answer remains complicated. Medieval record-keeping was uneven. Some regions recorded more carefully than others. Some records were lost. Mortality varied by place, by wave, by urban or rural setting, by social structure, by timing, perhaps by prior exposure or ecology. Historians debate totals, but broad estimates often suggest that between a third and a half of Europe's population may have died in the first Great Wave between 1347 and 1351, amounting to tens of millions of people. Those numbers are vast enough to risk abstraction. To say that perhaps half a village died can sound like a statistic. To live in the village would have meant empty benches, silent workshops, unclaimed tools, heirs too young, fields unworked, and names repeated in prayer until prayer itself wore thin. The scale of death matters, but scale alone does not explain remaking. What remade Europe was the combination of numerical loss and structural consequence. Too many people died too fast in places too important to leave the old order intact. Labor is one of the clearest places to see this. Medieval European society depended heavily on the assumption that labor was available, often coercible, and often cheap relative to land. Lords expected rents, services, and obligations. Towns expected apprentices and wage workers. Fields required bodies. Workshops required continuity. When the plague removed such a large share of the labor force, surviving workers acquired something previously rare in many regions: leverage. Not absolute freedom, not universal prosperity, but leverage. If there are fewer plowmen, the remaining plowmen matter more. If fewer tenants are available, landlords must bargain harder. If urban workshops cannot find enough hands, wages rise or conditions change. Suddenly, the old arithmetic of command no longer worked so smoothly. This did not produce instant emancipation or equality. Elites responded with laws, coercion, and attempts to freeze labor relations. But the social bargaining position of survivors had changed, and that mattered profoundly. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 became one of the most famous attempts to impose the past by law. Authorities tried to cap wages and require laborers to work at pre-plague rates, as if the demographic shock could be legislated out of existence. Similar efforts appeared elsewhere in different forms. These measures tell us something essential. Elites recognized the danger. They knew the plague had altered the labor market in favor of workers and tenants, and they feared what that might mean for hierarchy. The remaking of Europe, therefore, did not come from mortality alone. It came from the struggle over what mortality meant. Should the old order be restored by legal force, or should social relations adapt to the new scarcity? The answer varied by region and by decade, but the conflict itself became central to late medieval history. The plague did not simply remove people, it rearranged bargaining power. For peasants, this could mean real, if uneven, advantages. In some regions, rents fell or became easier to negotiate. Tenants could sometimes abandon poorer holdings and seek better terms elsewhere. Lords eager to keep land productive might offer concessions. Labor services could be commuted into money rents. In Western Europe especially, forms of serfdom weakened over time, though never in a single straight line and never solely because of the plague. The Black Death did not abolish coercion, but it eroded some of the material assumptions on which coercion rested. Peasants were not merely victims of the plague. Survivors could become negotiators within a transformed economy. That possibility would help fuel later unrest, including revolts that cannot be reduced to plague alone, but are hard to understand without its social consequences. Landlords responded in practical as well as legal ways. Some shifted from labor-intensive grain cultivation to less labor-hungry pastoral economies, especially sheep in parts of England. Some consolidated holdings. Some leased land differently. Some relied more on wage labor than customary service. Some simply failed and shrank. The countryside after the Black Death was not a uniform landscape of peasant triumph or aristocratic collapse. It was a landscape of adaptation. What matters is that adaptation became unavoidable. A world built on demographic density had to learn how to function with absence. Europe's economy did not merely recover from plague. It reorganized around its consequences. Urban life changed too. Guilds, workshops, and municipal governments faced shortages of skilled and unskilled labor. Survivors could command higher wages or move more freely. Family businesses had to absorb losses. Apprenticeship patterns shifted. Women sometimes entered economic roles more visibly because death had cleared or disrupted older arrangements. Widows could inherit tools, shops, leases, and responsibilities under conditions that expanded some possibilities while sharpening insecurity. Here too, change was not emancipation in any modern sense. Patriarchy remained powerful. Legal and social constraints remained real. But the plague opened cracks. It redistributed property. It accelerated inheritances. It created vacancies that had to be filled. When historians say the Black Death remade Europe, this is part of what they mean. The old social choreography of work, household authority, and property transmission could no longer be assumed. Family structure itself became more unstable and, in some cases, more fluid. Whole lineages ended. Children were orphaned. Widows and widowers remarried. Property changed hands quickly through death rather than slow generational succession. Dowries, inheritances, guardianships, and marriage strategies all had to adjust to loss. In some places, survivors found themselves relatively better off because more land, goods, or money concentrated in fewer hands. In others, vulnerability intensified because support networks had collapsed. Plague did not create one new family pattern. It created a landscape in which older assumptions about continuity were harder to rely on. The household, like the manor and the city, had to be rebuilt under demographic shock. The psychological and cultural consequences were equally large. The late medieval obsession with death did not begin in 1347, but the plague gave it new visibility and force. Art, preaching, devotional practice, and memory all took on darker, more urgent tones in many contexts. Skeleton imagery, danse macabre themes, memento mori motifs, and intensified concern with sudden death and judgment would flourish in later centuries, partly because the Black Death had demonstrated how quickly life could be cut short. The familiarity of death deepened. So did the desire to master it symbolically. Tombs, wills, chantries, memorials, confraternities, and spiritual intercessions all carried heightened weight in a culture where mortality no longer felt merely inevitable in the distant sense, but immediate and arbitrary. Europe was remade in imagination as much as in economy. The plague changed what people thought a life could safely assume. Literature captured this shift in different ways. Boccaccio's Decameron famously begins with plague-ridden Florence and then escapes into storytelling as both refuge and response. The frame itself is revealing. When reality becomes unbearable, narrative becomes survival, order, pleasure, and moral testing. Other chronicles, sermons, letters, and local records preserve different tonalities: lament, accusation, bewilderment, inventory. The Black Death generated not one literary voice, but many, because it struck every layer of society differently. Yet across these texts we hear a common pressure: language struggling to be adequate to scale. That struggle matters because one of the ways Europe was remade was through the effort to narrate catastrophe. Societies remember what they can describe. The plague forced Europe to invent new descriptive intensities. The Church's role after the first wave of plague reveals another long remaking. Clerical mortality could be severe. Replacing dead parish priests, monks, and administrators often required ordaining or promoting men more quickly, sometimes with less training. Standards could slip. Criticism could grow. This did not destroy the Church. Far from it. The Church remained central to European life. But the plague weakened some forms of confidence in clerical mediation. If the sacraments mattered more than ever and the clergy seemed more fragile or compromised than before, then religious life became at once more anxious and more open to scrutiny. Some historians have seen in this a distant precondition for later religious discontent, though the path from the Black Death to the Reformation is not simple. Still, the plague made it harder to imagine the Church as a perfectly stable guardian of order. Institutions survived. Their aura changed. Public health, in the modern sense, did not emerge full-grown from the Black Death, but responses to plague helped lay foundations for more organized practices of surveillance, quarantine, and municipal intervention. Italian city-states in particular would, over time, develop more systematic responses to epidemic threat. Health boards, pest houses, regulations on movement, and isolation protocols. One of the most famous early quarantine measures came later in Ragusa in 1377, after the first wave, requiring periods of isolation for arrivals from infected areas. Venice and other cities elaborated these techniques in subsequent generations. The important point is that plague taught governments that population movement and disease required not just prayer and ad hoc charity, but administration. Europe was remade by the growth of bureaucratic habits tied to health. Catastrophe became a teacher of state capacity. The Black Death also altered Europe's relation to time. Before the plague, bad harvests, wars, and local famines certainly created crisis, but the plague introduced a recurrent rhythm of return. It did not come once and vanish forever. It revisited. Later outbreaks in the later 14th and 15th centuries ensured that plague became not just memory, but expectation. A generation might survive the first wave only to watch children or grandchildren confront another. This matters because repeated plague made catastrophe part of normal political and social calculation. Marriage, inheritance, labor contracts, urban regulation, and religious devotion all unfolded under the shadow that plague might come again. Europe was not remade by one apocalyptic moment alone. It was remade by recurrence. Recurrence also complicates any easy story of recovery. The phrase Black Death often evokes the first Great Wave, but the remaking of Europe was cumulative. The initial demographic crash was shattering, but subsequent outbreaks prevented simple rebound. Population recovery in many places was slow. Labor scarcity lingered. Vacancies persisted. Institutions had to adapt not once, but repeatedly. A society can recover from singular crisis more easily than from recurring crisis that interrupts repair. This is one reason the Black Death's consequences lasted so long. The first blow was devastating. The repeated blows ensured structural change. Regional variation remained important throughout. Not every part of Europe experienced the same mortality, economic change, or social outcome. Eastern and Western Europe diverged in significant ways over time. In Western Europe, labor scarcity often contributed to weakening serfdom and greater wage leverage. In Eastern Europe, later developments could push in the opposite direction, tightening forms of labor coercion in what some historians describe as a second serfdom. The plague alone did not cause this divergence, but its demographic and economic effects interacted with political structures in different regions. Any claim that the Black Death remade Europe must therefore hold unity and diversity together. It was a continental event with local consequences. Its power lies partly in the fact that it transformed the whole while not transforming every part in the same way. England offers one especially vivid case of political aftermath. Rising wages, labor regulation, tax pressure, and social resentment helped create conditions that would feed into the peasants' revolt of 1381. That revolt had immediate causes beyond plague, especially taxation and state demands. But it unfolded in a world already altered by post-plague labor tension and sharpened expectations among common people. When laborers and peasants had experienced increased bargaining power and then watched elites try to legislate them back into subordination, political anger could attach itself to older grievances with new confidence. The plague did not write rebel manifestos, but it changed the social field in which rebellion became imaginable. Europe was remade because the relationship between ruler and ruled had been subjected to demographic strain no legal fiction could entirely hide. The Black Death also influenced elite consumption and cultural patronage in ways that can be hard to map but are impossible to ignore. With fewer people in some communities and more wealth concentrated among survivors, patterns of spending could shift. Better diets became possible for some. Land per capita increased in certain regions. Wages could buy more. Urban rebuilding and rural readjustment created new openings for investment. We should not romanticize this. Much prosperity rested on others' deaths. But historical transformation is often morally ugly. The Europe that emerged from plague was in some ways richer per survivor, while also more haunted. That combination matters. Material opportunity and existential anxiety advanced together. Even the language people used about the world subtly changed. A society repeatedly confronted by sudden mortality, may become more attentive to contingency. Fortune, chance, providence, corruption, and mutability all take on sharper meanings when death rearranges households overnight. Medieval Europeans already possessed rich vocabularies for suffering and transience. The plague made those vocabularies feel less literary and more immediate. The world seemed less trustworthy. This could feed piety, cynicism, hedonism, charity, suspicion, or disciplined reform depending on the person and setting. Catastrophe does not produce one psychology. It multiplies possible responses within a newly altered horizon. This is one reason the Black Death resists reduction to a single moral. Was it a destroyer? Obviously. Was it a creator of new possibilities? Also yes. Did it weaken old hierarchies? In some places. Did it intensify violence and exclusion? Absolutely. Did it deepen faith? For some. Did it damage trust in institutions? Also for some. The plague remade Europe precisely because it operated through contradiction. It devastated bodies while opening bargaining power. It intensified religious feeling while unsettling religious authority. It encouraged public health administration while revealing governmental weakness. It made some survivors materially better off and many spiritually more insecure. Any documentary honest enough to carry the Black Death has to resist the temptation to turn it into simple tragedy or simple progress. It was both less comforting and more historically powerful than either label allows. When people today imagine the plague, they often imagine only the dramatic moments: ship arrivals, bells, carts, masks from later centuries anachronistically inserted, piles of bodies, blackened skin, panic in streets. Those images are not wholly false, but they miss the slower remaking. The Black Death changed law codes, labor contracts, inheritance patterns, devotional habits, urban administration, village memory, artistic imagination, and the very expectation of what rulers and institutions should be able to do in crisis. It changed how communities understood absence. It changed what work was worth. It changed who could bargain. It changed how proximity felt. It changed the relationship between death and everyday planning. That is what it means to say Europe was remade. Not simply that millions died, but that the world made for the living could not continue on the same assumptions afterward. It is also worth remembering that the people inside the plague did not know they were becoming historical hinge points. A widow trying to keep a holding together, a laborer asking for higher wages, a priest deciding whether to remain with the sick, a city official deciding whether to close a gate, a Jewish family fearing accusation, an enslaved or servile worker hearing new possibilities in demographic scarcity, a merchant wondering whether ships should still unload. None of these people needed the phrase remaking Europe to understand that the ground was shifting beneath them. History later names transformations. Contemporaries live them as emergencies, adaptations, losses, and choices made without guarantee. The Black Death became epic not because people saw the whole from above, but because their local responses accumulated into civilizational change. That accumulation can be seen in architecture and landscape as much as in text. Some villages were abandoned. Some churches expanded burial grounds. Some urban plots changed use. Some roads lost traffic and others gained importance. Fields reverted or were reassigned. Men or income patterns shifted. In this sense, the plague is visible in the geography of late medieval Europe if you know how to read for absence. Emptying is part of history. A continent can be remade not only by what is built, but by what is no longer maintained, no longer taxed, no longer inherited, no longer staffed, no longer heard at dusk through an open window. The plague's silence was productive in a strange way. It made space, and space changed value. By the 15th century, Europe was not over the Black Death. It was living in the world the Black Death had helped make. Population remained below pre-plague peaks in many regions. Wages, rents, and labor relations had changed. Cities had adapted. States had learned. Religious life bore the marks. Art and literature carried the memory. Recurrent outbreaks ensured that plague remained not just ancestral nightmare, but civic possibility. The continent that would eventually produce Renaissance courts, stronger monarchies, growing state bureaucracies, and later global empires was not separate from the plague-struck Europe of the mid-14th century. In important ways, it emerged from it. To say that the Black Death remade Europe is therefore not to isolate the plague as a horror outside normal history. It is to recognize it as one of the forces that pushed Europe into a different normal. And yet modern viewers should be cautious about using the Black Death as a comforting story about renewal through catastrophe. The plague did not kill millions so that wages might rise or bureaucracies improve. It was not a benevolent correction. It was indiscriminate in some ways and brutally patterned in others. It created openings, yes, but openings do not redeem mass death. The right moral stance is not gratitude for the plague's long-term consequences. It is honesty about the fact that societies change when people die at scale, and those changes can favor survivors in some respects even while remaining rooted in grief, violence, and terror. Historical maturity means holding both truths at once. If you want to understand the Black Death's deepest legacy, think of trust. Trust in the body, trust in neighbors, trust in priests, trust in physicians, trust in rulers, trust in markets, trust in the future. The plague did not destroy trust everywhere, but it destabilized it almost everywhere. Once a society learns that normal life can become mass death with terrifying speed, every institution must prove itself under new conditions. Some do, some fail, some survive but emerge diminished. The remaking of Europe was, in part, the remaking of what could still be trusted after catastrophe. The plague also altered Europe's imagination of itself in relation to the wider world. Long-distance trade had brought wealth and danger together. Ports and routes were now seen not only as blessings, but as exposure points. Movement could not be romanticized so innocently. Yet Europe did not turn inward permanently. Trade resumed. Cities revived. Contact continued. The lesson was not that connection should end, but that connection carries consequence. In that sense, the Black Death was one of the first great European crises of interdependence. It forced societies to confront how deeply their fate depended on systems extending far beyond local control. This is why the Black Death still feels modern. Not because medieval plague is the same as any modern crisis, but because it exposes recurring structures, mobility and vulnerability, expertise and uncertainty, scapegoating and fear, labor disruption, institutional strain, contested memory, unequal suffering, and the political struggle to convert catastrophe into meaning. The technologies change. The microbes differ. The structures return. The Black Death remains gripping because it is at once profoundly medieval and disturbingly recognizable. And perhaps that is the final reason it deserves to be called the event that remade Europe. It did not merely interrupt European history. It forced Europe to renegotiate nearly every level of social existence at once: economic, political, religious, familial, psychological, and cultural. It transformed the relationship between rulers and ruled, lords and laborers, clergy and laity, town and countryside, memory and mortality. It made old inequalities more visible, sometimes more violent, sometimes more vulnerable. It opened the door to adaptation not because anyone wanted transformation, but because the old order could not survive intact after such loss. When the first plague ships entered European waters, no one could have known that they were carrying not just disease, but a new shape of history. Yet that is what happened. The Black Death arrived as illness. It remained as structure. It began in fever, swelling, and breath. It ended by changing land, labor, law, faith, art, government, and the imagination of life itself. Europe after the Black Death was still Europe. Its languages, rulers, churches, fields, and cities endured. But they endured in altered relation to one another and to death. The continent had been cut, and the scar changed how everything moved. That is why the Black Death was not only a catastrophe, it was a refounding through ruin. Not a clean beginning, not a moral improvement, not a singular cause of all that followed, but a profound rearrangement of what Europe could be. It forced a civilization to continue after discovering how fragile its assumptions had been. And in that continued life, in the wages argued over, the prayers whispered, the laws imposed, the scapegoats hunted, the villages emptied, the markets reopened, the children orphaned, the institutions patched together, and the memories written down, Europe was remade. To see how the Black Death remade Europe, it helps to slow the story down and watch it enter specific places. In Italy, the catastrophe acquired one of its clearest urban forms because the peninsula's commercial cities were among the most connected places in Europe. Genoa, Venice, Pisa, Florence, Siena, and others sat inside dense webs of banking, shipping, craft production, and political rivalry. These cities were used to contingency. War, faction, market shocks, and food shortages were nothing new. But plague penetrated more deeply because it touched every household category at once. It did not matter whether one's labor was in silk, wool, law, shipping, grain, or government. The disease made no distinction useful to civic administration. Some magistrates tried to regulate movement, remove waste, or supervise burial, but their powers ran up against the practical fact that too many people were falling ill too quickly. In cities where literacy and record-keeping were relatively advanced, we can sometimes glimpse the scale of disorder in wills drafted hastily, contracts interrupted, guild life destabilized, or tax assumptions rendered obsolete. Italy, therefore, offers not only some of the most vivid cultural memories of the plague, but also some of the clearest evidence that urban sophistication did not protect a society from systemic biological shock. If anything, sophistication magnified the visibility of failure. Florence has become one of the emblematic plague cities largely through Boccaccio, but literary fame should not obscure historical substance. Florence in the mid-14th century was a powerful commercial and banking center whose prosperity rested on labor, credit, textile production, and international exchange. When plague struck, the city's social density became a liability. Wealthier families could flee if they had country houses, but flight itself did not guarantee safety. Servants, carriers, and networks of dependents traveled with people. The poor had fewer options. They stayed in crowded spaces, worked until they could not, or depended on charitable and institutional structures already under strain. One of the reasons Boccaccio's account has endured is that it sees not only mortality, but behavior. Some people became austere. Some became indulgent. Some isolated. Some abandoned restraint. Some fled relatives. Some remained with them. A catastrophe at urban scale becomes a laboratory of moral variety. The plague in Florence is therefore important not because it reveals a single human truth, but because it reveals how many contradictory truths can coexist when death accelerates beyond custom. A city famed for brilliance became equally famous for fragility. England's experience gives the Black Death a different texture because it allows us to trace the aftermath into law, labor, and revolt with unusual clarity. The plague reached England in 1348 and spread with devastating effect. Ports, towns, monasteries, villages, and manors all felt the blow. Parish records, manorial documents, court rolls, and later legal measures show how deeply labor scarcity shook the English social order. Lords lost tenants. Land went underworked. Wages rose. Servants and laborers moved in search of better terms. Authorities responded with statutes designed to compel work at pre-plague rates, as though custom could be enforced against demography. But laws cannot produce workers out of graves. What England shows with unusual force is the mismatch between legal imagination and economic reality. The ruling classes could insist that society should function as before. The plague ensured that before was gone. Over time, this contributed to a harsher politics of social control, but also to a new boldness among common people. When laborers know they are needed, they speak differently. When elites know they are losing leverage, they legislate anxiously. The long arc from plague to the peasants' revolt is not direct, yet the connection is real because both belong to a world in which hierarchy had been demographically destabilized. France offers another angle, because there the plague overlapped with the ongoing violence and disruption of the 100 Years' War. War and plague do not simply add to one another, they interact. Armies move people and goods, destroy crops, increase taxation, and strain local authorities. They also create fear, displacement, and rumor. When plague entered a society already burdened by war, every administrative weakness was magnified. Royal authority needed money. Communities needed relief. Clergy needed replacement. Local elites needed to preserve rents. The population needed survival. These priorities did not align neatly. In plague-stricken France, as elsewhere, one sees how biological catastrophe can intensify existing political crisis rather than replace it. The image of the plague as an isolated disaster misses this fusion. Europe was not paused by the Black Death and then restarted. Ongoing conflicts, long-term economic patterns, and pre-existing inequalities continued to operate inside the epidemic, sometimes in accelerated form. That is part of why the consequences were so uneven and so profound. Iberia reminds us that the plague moved through religiously and politically complex societies where Christian kingdoms, Muslim polities, Jewish communities, trade networks, and frontier dynamics intersected. The Black Death did not arrive in a culturally simple space. It entered regions already shaped by conquest, coexistence, tension, and diverse legal regimes. This matters because epidemic response is always filtered through local political culture. Patterns of scapegoating, governance, charity, and record-keeping differed. So did the ways communities imagined divine wrath or political blame. A pan-European plague therefore never looked exactly the same from Castile, Aragon, southern Italy, or England. And yet the cross-continental similarities remain striking. Mortality shocks, labor realignment, anti-Jewish violence, crisis of trust, and attempts by authorities to preserve social hierarchy through command. The plague's unity lies in recurrence of pattern, not in perfect sameness of experience. Even regions less densely documented in the modern imagination were transformed. Scandinavian kingdoms experienced the plague through maritime and overland routes that carried it into ports and inland communities with devastating force. Sparse population did not guarantee safety. In some places, depopulation could feel even starker because communities were smaller and more fragile to begin with. Ecclesiastical structures thinned. Local economies staggered. The plague's reach into Northern Europe matters because it prevents us from imagining the Black Death as mainly a Mediterranean and English story. It was continental in scope. A society organized very differently from Tuscany could still be brought to crisis by the same pathogen. That fact underscores just how wide the remaking was. Burial practices offer another window into the transformation. Death on normal scales can be absorbed by ritual. Death on plague scales strains ritual to breaking. Cemeteries filled. Graves multiplied. Priests lacked time. Mourners could not always gather in expected ways. In some places, mass graves or hurried burials became necessary, not because communities ceased to care, but because caring had to submit to numbers. That submission is historically important. Ritual is how societies defend meaning against death. When ritual itself becomes compressed, abbreviated, or overwhelmed, people experience loss not only as absence, but as a failure of form. They cannot grieve properly because proper grief requires time, space, clergy, money, and surviving kin. The Black Death stole not only lives, but the normal ceremonies by which lives were incorporated into memory. That alone can change a culture for generations. Children experience the plague in ways adult records often blur. They lost parents, siblings, caretakers, and ordinary rhythms of security. Some inherited unexpectedly. Some became wards. Some entered service earlier. Some were moved between households after deaths rearranged obligations. The demographic blow thus had a generational dimension that economic history alone cannot capture. A society in which large numbers of children grow up inside plague memory will not imagine stability the same way as one that has known only ordinary mortality. Childhood after the plague was often shaped by fragility in inheritance, guardianship, and social expectation. Europe was remade because the next generation was formed in households already altered by absence. Older people faced different terrors. They were not only vulnerable to illness, but often watched established lines of transmission fail around them. Skills that had passed from master to apprentice, mother to daughter, priest to curate, tenant to heir, could be broken. When enough deaths occur in a short time, institutional memory suffers. Who knows the boundaries of the holding? Who knows the debts? Who remembers the proper procedures, the brewing methods, the craft secrets, the local diplomatic habits, the seasonal repairs, the oral obligations that were never written down? The Black Death did not just kill bodies. It interrupted chains of knowledge. Some of that knowledge was rebuilt. Some vanished. Europe after the plague therefore inherited not only fewer people, but altered memory. There is also a sensory history of the plague that matters. Historians can estimate mortality and trace legal change, but the lived reality included smell, sound, texture, and atmosphere. The smell of illness and unburied bodies. The sound of church bells, or Just as hauntingly, the silence after bells became too frequent to distinguish one death from another. The sound of carts, of hurried footsteps, of prayers muttered at thresholds, of coughing in adjoining rooms. The texture of hot skin, swollen lymph nodes, damp bedding, dirty bandages, and hastily dug earth. The Black Death remade Europe partly because it rewrote the sensory meaning of ordinary spaces. A house, a market, a church, a port, a bed, a road. Each could now signify contamination as much as function. That sensory remapping outlasts the immediate crisis. People do not easily forget places that once became synonymous with fear. We should also pause on the physicians and natural philosophers who tried to explain the plague within the intellectual tools available to them. Medieval medicine is often caricatured as comic failure, but that misses both its seriousness and its limits. Learned physicians were drawing from ancient authorities, environmental observation, logic, and inherited medical frameworks that had worked, or seemed to work, for many conditions. They were not irrational. They were wrong in ways that reveal the historical distance between explanation and control. Some plague treatises carefully analyzed air, seasons, stars, corruption, and bodily temperament. Others recommended practical measures of avoidance. Still others became formulaic. What matters for historical transformation is not that medicine failed in a simplistic sense, but that society watched learned systems strained in public. The plague became a test case for whether knowledge could command reality. That question would not disappear when the epidemic waned. It became part of Europe's longer intellectual history. The same is true of law. A legal system assumes continuity. It assumes that contracts can be enforced, land can be inherited, labor can be compelled, rents can be collected, courts can convene, and officials can be found. The Black Death shook each of those assumptions. Lords died, heirs died, judges died, witnesses died, tenants vanished, debtors vanished. Entire legal disputes changed shape because the people involved were gone. Some lawsuits died with litigants. Others multiplied because property transfers became suddenly contentious. Local courts had to improvise around absence. Documentary culture became more important in some settings precisely because memory and testimony were less reliable after mass mortality. The plague therefore strengthened some habits of record-keeping even while undermining the social continuity those records presupposed. The relationship between countryside and town changed as well. Before the plague, many towns depended on a hinterland that could reliably supply food, labor, and migrants. After the plague, that dependence remained, but the balance shifted. Towns still needed grain and bodies. Villages could no longer always be assumed to supply them at old levels. This sometimes enhanced the bargaining power of rural producers and laborers. In other cases, it weakened towns that could not replenish themselves. Migration patterns could change. Vacant urban opportunities might attract country people. Empty rural holdings might tempt survivors to move outward. The old equilibrium between urban demand and rural supply became less predictable. Europe was remade because demographic shock rearranged not just social classes, but spatial relationships within regional economies. Consider also the emotional politics of survival. In any catastrophe where many die and some live, survival creates awkward moral economies. Why did one family remain intact while the neighbors were buried? Why did one merchant recover while another died? Why did one priest survive a month of tending the sick while another fell after one visit? Some people interpreted survival as divine favor. Others interpreted it as luck. Others, perhaps more darkly, interpreted it as evidence that the world was no longer morally legible. Such feelings matter historically because they shape generosity, envy, piety, and resentment. The Black Death did not simply create solidarity or selfishness. It created a moral field in which both could flourish. The plague also altered relations between elite and popular culture. When mortality is generalized, elites cannot maintain full symbolic distance from common suffering. Noble blood does not stop infection. Urban magistrates can die like apprentices. Monks can die like peasants. This does not erase hierarchy, but it introduces a new dramatic equality in vulnerability. Medieval culture already knew that death comes for all, yet plague made that proposition socially visible in an especially brutal way. Images and sermons emphasizing the equality of death did not emerge into a vacuum. They emerged into a world that had seen grand households and poor cottages alike invaded by the same terror. That visibility of shared vulnerability could intensify humility, but it could also deepen elite panic because the social distinction they relied upon seemed less protective than before. And yet hierarchy persisted. This is important. The Black Death did not flatten Europe into sameness. The rich still had more options to flee, isolate, or purchase care. The poor still suffered from crowding, undernourishment, and weaker protections. Jews still faced persecution. Servile people remained constrained. Women remained disadvantaged in law and custom. The plague exposed a universal vulnerability while leaving unequal structures very much alive. That combination is one reason the event remains so historically rich. It is not a morality tale in which all become equal through suffering. It is a history in which suffering reveals both common human fragility and stubborn social injustice. By forcing a revaluation of labor, the plague also changed attitudes toward time and work. Where workers are abundant, individual time is cheap. Where workers are scarce, individual time acquires price. Employers notice absences differently. Deadlines become harder to meet. Labor-saving adjustments become attractive. The post-plague world therefore had a different temporal pressure. Delays mattered more when replacement was difficult. This subtle revaluation helped reshape economic behavior. One can see in later late medieval developments a sharper concern with wage regulation, labor discipline, and the monetization of work. The plague did not invent these trends, but it accelerated the conditions under which they became more urgent. There were political consequences at the level of monarchy as well. Kings and princely rulers discovered that fiscal and military systems depend on population health more than court ritual admits. Tax bases shrink when taxpayers die. Armies suffer when recruitment pools thin. Administration weakens when clerks and local officials vanish. The plague therefore contributed to a harsher awareness among rulers that effective government required more systematic extraction and more systematic preservation of the taxable, governable population. This could support stronger statecraft in the long term, but it could also intensify coercion in the short term as rulers tried to recover revenue from a diminished society. The remaking of Europe by plague is thus tied, in part, to the remaking of what government had to watch, count, and preserve. The Black Death's impact on universities and learned culture is sometimes understated. Universities lost masters and students. Curricula continued, but in altered circumstances. Intellectual communities had to absorb mortality just like any other institution. At the same time, the demand for interpretation increased. More treatises were written. More explanations were sought. More records were made. This paradox matters. Catastrophe can damage institutions of learning while also increasing their social demand. That tension would remain familiar in later crises. Europe's intellectual life was not destroyed by plague. It was pressed into new tasks by it. Knowledge had to explain a world that felt less secure. That pressure is part of what makes the late medieval world after the plague intellectually restless rather than merely broken. Some historians have asked whether the Black Death helped create conditions favorable to the Renaissance. The question is tricky and can easily become simplistic. The plague did not cause the Renaissance in any direct, single line. Yet it did contribute to demographic, economic, and cultural rearrangements in Italy and beyond that shaped the later environment in which patronage, urban competition, and new forms of cultural ambition could flourish. A society with concentrated wealth among survivors, altered labor markets, and a sharpened awareness of mortality may invest differently in memory, prestige, and beauty. The point is not to turn plague into a blessing. It is to recognize that later European creativity unfolded within a world already changed by mass death. The Renaissance, where it came after plague, not apart from it. The Black Death also lingered in law and administration through what might be called prophylactic memory. Once a society has faced one disaster of this kind, its institutions begin to carry anticipatory traces. Ports inspect. Towns debate closure. Officials ask about origins, routes, and suspected contamination. Isolation spaces are imagined. Movement is watched. These are not fully modern systems, but they matter because they turn past catastrophe into future procedure. Europe was remade partly because it became a continent that had to remember administratively. and memory itself became stratified. Some communities remembered the plague through anniversary masses or charitable foundations. Some remembered through abandoned villages and family stories. Some through anti-Jewish myths. Some through wage expectations. Some through devotional art. Some through law. There was never one memory of the Black Death because there had never been one experience of it. What unified the memories was scale. Everyone knew that something beyond normal history had happened. A society can absorb war into dynastic chronology. The Black Death became harder to domesticate. It insisted on being remembered as rupture. If all of this sounds like too much weight for one epidemic, that is precisely the point. The Black Death was heavy enough to bend nearly every institution it touched. That bending did not break Europe beyond repair. It bent Europe into another shape. A continent of lords, peasants, clergy, merchants, towns, and monarchs remained, but the ratios changed. The expectations changed. The fears changed. The opportunities changed. The relationship between body and society changed. The relationship between death and policy changed. The relationship between work and worth changed. The relationship between memory and daily life changed. Those are not minor effects. They are civilizational ones. And still, after all of this, we should keep one final caution in mind. The Black Death did not remake Europe according to any plan. It had no ideology. It had no purpose. It did not choose the future. Human beings did that, inside the wreckage it left behind. Some chose violence. Some chose adaptation. Some chose legislation, prayer, exploitation, charity, migration, scapegoating, rebuilding, or remembering. The plague created conditions. People made worlds inside them. That is why the history remains morally alive. Europe was remade not only by what the disease did to it, but by what Europeans then did with and to one another in response. In the end, the Black Death should be understood as a profound experiment in involuntary social transformation. It stripped away enough of the old order to show which parts were resilient, which were brittle, and which could be reassembled only in altered form. It demonstrated that labor, belief, authority, and memory are not static things. They depend on the number of living people available to carry them. When those numbers collapse, societies are forced to reveal what they can change and what they will kill to preserve. Medieval Europe revealed both. One often overlooked dimension of the Black Death is ecological. Medieval people experienced the plague as divine wrath, poisoned air, bad fortune, or human malice, but beneath their explanations lay a world of rodents, fleas, storage systems, climate variation, and grain movement. Barns, ships, warehouses, and urban refuse all created environments in which non-human life intersected lethally with human life. This matters because it reminds us that Europe was remade not just by human institutions, but by the way those institutions inhabited animal ecologies they barely noticed until catastrophe translated them into death. Ports, granaries, merchant vessels, and town streets were shared environments even if medieval people lacked the conceptual tools to describe them that way. The Black Death is therefore also a history of the hidden intimacy between human civilization and the small creatures living inside its infrastructure. A continent proud of its trade routes discovered that the line between commerce and contagion could be measured in fur, fleas, and food stores. Household objects became charged in plague time. A bed was no longer simply where one slept. It might be where fever began. A blanket might warm or infect. A cup might comfort or carry risk. Clothing, bedding, tools, and furniture moved through inheritance in accelerated ways as deaths redistributed property, but each object could also carry emotional residue. The dead do not leave empty hands alone. They leave rooms full of things. In a plague, those things become practical questions. Who will wear the coat? Who will keep the tools? Can the mattress be used? Can the house be entered? Material culture after the Black Death was therefore not only about economic redistribution. It was about intimate negotiation with traces of the dead. Europe's remaking took place through objects as much as through laws. Migration in the aftermath deserves more attention too. When labor shortages opened opportunities, people moved. A servant might leave one manor for another offering better wages. A craftsman might relocate to a town with vacancies. A widow might remarry into a different holding. A family might abandon an overburdened or marginal site. This circulation did not erase the terror of the plague, but it converted death into mobility for survivors. Medieval society was never static, yet the post-plague world made movement more consequential because position had loosened. Bonds of dependence remained, but they were tested by the simple fact that fewer people were available to do necessary work. A continent that had been demographically crowded became, for a time, more open in specific labor and settlement terms. That openness was not freedom in any modern democratic sense. It was constrained, unequal, and reversible, but it mattered enough to shift expectations. The language of complaint changed with it. When laborers know their work is scarce, they complain differently. When tenants know land lies empty, they negotiate differently. When lords know they cannot replace people easily, they threaten differently. The post-plague world sharpened political speech from below as much as from above. We should imagine not only statutes and charters, but kitchen arguments, tavern boasts, market complaints, and whispered calculations. Why should I work for that wage? Is a different question in a depopulated village than in a crowded one. Why should I remain on this holding? Becomes more dangerous when exit is possible. Europe was remade because millions of tiny negotiations shifted beneath the threshold of grand chronicle. The Black Death also transformed charity. Medieval Christian societies were already rich in almsgiving, confraternities, hospitals, and lay religious support networks. But plague stretched charity into emergency relief under conditions of repeated mass need. Who should be fed when labor has collapsed? Who buries the poor? Who supports orphans? Who tends the sick when family fails? Municipal and religious institutions often tried to answer these questions, but their capacities varied sharply. The failures mattered, yet so did the responses. In some places, crisis accelerated more organized forms of urban charity and hospital management. In others, it exposed how limited existing systems were. The poor never stopped being vulnerable, but the visibility of mass distress forced communities to confront poverty, abandonment, and care more directly than before. Europe's moral economy was altered because charity had to operate at plague scale. The experience of repeated plague also changed attitudes toward planning and risk. A prudent household after the Black Death might think differently about storing grain, writing wills, arranging marriages, or maintaining ties beyond the immediate family. Merchants might diversify or calculate delay differently. Towns might take reports of disease elsewhere more seriously because elsewhere had already become here once before. This is a subtle but major form of remaking. The future itself looked less stable. A society that has endured epidemiological shock becomes more accustomed to contingency, that can produce caution, fatalism, improvisation, or sharper administration depending on the context. In Europe after the Black Death, all four appeared. Even humor and festivity could change tone. Carnival, feasting, drinking, and mockery did not vanish after plague. In some places they may even have intensified because death sharpened appetite for immediate life. This is another contradiction the disaster produced. Heightened mortality can deepen piety and deepen pleasure at the same time. If life is uncertain, devotion becomes urgent, but so does appetite. The Black Death did not create a continent of uniform solemnity. It also created a continent more conscious that tomorrow could disappear, and that knowledge can feed indulgence as readily as restraint. Again, remaking does not mean one emotional outcome. It means a new intensity across outcomes. The experience of elites is worth lingering over because they often left better records and because their responses reveal the strain on governance. Noble households could retreat, isolate, or relocate more effectively than poorer ones, yet they depended on servants, tenants, clerks, chaplains, and local officials who were equally subject to plague. A nobleman could flee to a country estate only to discover that the estate itself lacked labor, administration, or healthy attendance. Courts could disperse, councils could thin, military campaigns could be disrupted, dynastic strategies could be scrambled by sudden deaths. The plague did not democratize power, but it forced elites to feel dependence more acutely. They still commanded, but command rested on bodies now harder to secure. That realization had long-term political consequences because rulers and nobles increasingly understood that population itself was a form of wealth and power. This helps explain why later medieval and early modern states would become more interested in counting, regulating, and protecting populations. The Black Death did not invent demographic thinking, but it made the value of people starkly visible to power. In a depopulated world, subjects are labor, tax base, militia pool, market demand, and symbolic vitality all at once. The plague taught rulers that losing bodies meant losing capacity. Some of the later history of European statecraft can be read through this lesson. Population was no longer just the backdrop of power. It was one of power's central objects. Memory of abandoned settlements carries a special force in plague history. There is something uniquely haunting about a village that did not die in battle, burn in raid, or drown in flood, but simply emptied over time because too many people died and the survivors moved elsewhere. Archaeology and documentary history both preserve these absences. Deserted medieval villages are among the most eloquent monuments to the Black Death's long-term consequences. They show that catastrophe can be legible in missing continuity. The church still stands, perhaps. The field boundaries remain. But the people are gone. The social world that animated the place is gone. Remade Europe includes not only famous cities and revolts, but silent villages left behind by demographic collapse and economic change. There is also a geopolitical dimension to the plague's legacy. Europe after the Black Death remained politically fragmented, but the balance among regions could shift as some zones recovered differently from others. Labor structures diverged. Urban fortunes fluctuated. Some states and cities developed stronger administrative habits through epidemic management and fiscal adjustment. Others remained weaker or more locally fractured. The plague did not determine these later outcomes in a deterministic way, but it entered the calculation everywhere. It is one of the background conditions of late medieval transformation that no serious account can ignore. The plague's relationship to empire is equally revealing. Europe was not only transformed internally, it also remained connected to wider Eurasian systems that had helped deliver the disease in the first place. Yet instead of retreating permanently from connection, Europeans eventually expanded further outward across oceans in the centuries that followed. This irony should not be missed. A continent traumatized by interconnection did not abandon interconnection. It mastered, reconfigured, and later weaponized it on larger scales. The Black Death therefore sits uneasily near the prehistory of European expansion. The same civilization that learned how vulnerable connectivity could make it would later build empires of connectivity with immense consequences for others. No single event explains Europe's later global rise, and the Black Death certainly should not be turned into a hidden engine of imperial destiny. But it belongs to the story because it altered labor, land use, state attention, urban development, and cultural memory in ways that shaped the societies that later expanded. Catastrophe can strengthen some societies relative to others not because catastrophe is good, but because survivors reorganize. Europe reorganized after plague. That reorganization became part of what later history inherited. The way historians frame the Black Death can itself reveal how modern people think about catastrophe. Some accounts emphasize collapse and barbarity. Others emphasize labor gains and opportunity. Some focus on epidemiology, others on religion or economy. The truth is that all of these lenses are necessary and none is sufficient alone. A continent was remade through overlapping registers: microbial, demographic, political, moral, material, and imaginative. If one tells only the story of death counts, Europe's later restructuring looks mysterious. If one tells only the story of higher wages, the suffering that made those wages possible becomes obscene to ignore. Historical honesty requires refusing the comfort of single-cause explanation. And that refusal leads back to the title itself: How Europe Was Remade. Not reborn, not saved, not improved in any simple sense. Remade. The word matters because remaking implies destruction and continuity together. A thing remade is not new from nothing. It is old material forced into a different pattern. The Black Death did exactly that to Europe. It took old institutions, old hierarchies, old beliefs, old roads, old towns, old hatreds, and old hopes, then subjected them to pressure so severe that they reassembled differently. Some pieces broke, some hardened, some slipped into new positions. That is what the plague's century-long legacy looks like. So when we look at Europe after the Black Death, we should not ask only, how many died? We should also ask, what became thinkable afterward that had been harder to imagine before? Better wages for laborers in some regions, stronger efforts by elites to regulate work, more visible state concern with population, different household structures, different burial practices, different artistic obsessions, different religious strains, different rhythms of movement and memory. These are the fingerprints of remaking. They show that the plague changed the horizon of possibility as much as the register of mortality. In the final measure, the Black Death endures in history because it reveals a brutal truth about civilizations. They are not undone only by the things they build, but by the shocks that expose how those things depend on living bodies. Europe's fields, courts, churches, shops, ports, and palaces all presumed people. When plague took those people away, the structures did not vanish at once, but they could no longer function on old terms. Out of that dysfunction came a different Europe, not by design, not by justice, but unmistakably, irreversibly, and at enormous human cost. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is that no one in 1348 could see the full arc. No one standing in a plague-struck street in Florence, or in a half-empty English village, or at a burial trench outside a French town, could say with confidence that Europe would survive in altered form rather than collapse into something unrecognizable. Historical actors never get our hindsight. They get hunger, rumor, weather, grief, and the next necessary task. That is why the Black Death matters so much as history rather than parable. It was lived minute by minute, not chapter by chapter. A mason still had to decide whether to take work on a house where someone had just died. A priest still had to decide whether to enter the room of the feverish. A widow still had to decide whether to remarry, lease, move, or hold. A magistrate still had to decide whether to close gates, regulate prices, or bury the dead first and ask questions later. Civilizations are remade through such decisions long before later generations name them as turning points. And in that sense, the Black Death was one of the greatest forcing events in European history. It forced a continent to discover which bonds were real, which loyalties were brittle, which hierarchies depended on abundance, which hatreds could be mobilized by fear, which institutions could still function under pressure, and which forms of human care survived even when care itself was dangerous. It forced Europe to continue after learning how quickly normal life could be stripped away. The result was not a cleaner or better civilization. It was a more self-conscious one, a more haunted one, a more administratively alert one, a more unequal one in some places and more fluid one in others, a Europe that had looked into a demographic abyss and kept going. That, finally, is what it means to say the Black Death remade Europe. It changed not just how people died, but how the living understood work, faith, power, fear, memory, and one another. And once those understandings changed, the old Europe was gone, even where its stones still stood. The road from plague to later Europe was never straight, and that too is part of the lesson. Remaking does not mean instant replacement. It means that after a shock of sufficient magnitude, the old language of continuity begins to hide more than it explains. People still prayed in familiar churches, traded in familiar markets, and served familiar lords, but the ratios had changed. Their dead were too many, their labor too valuable, their fears too justified, their memories too recent. They inhabited old forms under new pressure. In that tension between continuity and alteration lies the real history of the Black Death. Europe did not wake up one morning and discover that it had become modern. It discovered, slowly and painfully, that it could not become what it had been again.